Hey everybody, welcome back to the video. We're going to do another companion video, but this time for the 1976 Topps. I think it'll be cool, it'll be interesting. There's a lot of information I'd like to get into. Some things you may know, some things you might not know, but I'd like you to stick around to the end because there's a story that kind of relates to 1976 Topps and a former NBC Today Show host. So stick around, let's get into it. Let's start off with the anniversaries. The year of 1976 Topps was the 200th anniversary of the United States. Topps really didn't discuss that or bring that in or insert any cards into it, which in my opinion was perfectly fine. They're two separate things, but there was no, recognition. There was no intertwining of that time with the 76 Topps to, celebrate the 200th anniversary of the United States. But also that we're going to discuss anniversaries. That was the 25th anniversary of Topps baseball. They did base it on 1951 when Topps first released their playing cards. Baseball players, it wasn't the first year of, what we think is Topps in 1952. But the anniversary going back, if you look at some subsequent sets, they based it on 1951. And the reason I brought that up, I thought it was very interesting, was the fact that in 2001, Topps did, symbolize or show the 50th anniversary on their cards. As well as this year, 2026, where they did it with the 75th anniversary. They did recognize it, they did embrace it, and that could be the difference in the card culture as we went forward, and not a point in 1976. And why didn't they celebrate 25 years of Topps baseball? But it's something interesting to note the fact that these were three separate intervals, and Topps, as they progressed into the 2000s and the 2020s now, they did recognize and celebrate their anniversaries going forward. But 1976 was just 1976 Topps and nothing else. Now, there's another interesting thing about 1976 as well. They were experimenting with those cloth stickers. With 1976, they never released them, but they were testing them, and I believe there's prototypes out there. Did you get your hands on one or not? Something that was never supposed to go out to the public, but they did start experimenting with 76 Topps and these cloth kind of cards that they had, and they went through 4 different kinds of fabrics that they tested internally with Topps with the 76 design, but it never was released to the public. They basically, I think, were doing some sort of, trial run, because 77 did introduce cloth stickers to the public, which were for kids to put on their jackets or coats or whatever. It was kind of the idea of putting those players, somewhere on your clothing, so they had like a patch or an iron-on patch or some sort of patch that you could display the card. Another cool thing that Topps did, and they've done these kind of mail-in order kind of things in the past, and I know in the 80s, I was doing some of those with some of the glossy inserts that Topps offered, where you send in a couple packets with a self-addressed stamped envelope and this and that, and they would send you some cards. And I remember that, and I believe it was the 87 Topps where they had these glossy, like, all-star inserts. I could be off, but I do remember that as a kid, and sending that away and waiting and waiting and waiting. And, after a month and a half, 2 months, it would finally come in the mail. Well, in 76, they did something similar where they let kids, they would send a wax wrapper paper, and I think it was 50 cents to Topps in one, wax wrapper from a pack that they opened. And they sent away to Topps, and what Topps would send them was a 24, I think it was 24. Let me make sure I'm looking at my notes. Yeah, 24 team checklist card, and it was an uncut sheet of the 24 teams. And you would get that from Topps as, as kind of a gift, I guess you would say, for, sending in the packet and that. And I don't know if many people did that, but it was a nice, interesting touch that allowed Topps to kind of, allow kids in those days to get something different that wasn't in the, in the cards themselves, that big uncut sheet of team players. So, Topps in 1976 had its share of a few error cards and error issues that came out. Nothing dramatic, but there were a few issues out there that people noticed. One was there was a run of cards that didn't print the black ink on the back of those cards, which was, the stats, the bio, the little cartoon on the back. So some of those did get out into the public. They were disseminated in the packs, produced and sent out. Obviously, that was fixed, but those cards did get out, and that was a small error, production error, printing error, whatever you want to call it. Not a huge issue, but it was something to point out in 1976 Topps. The second one was a gentleman by the name of, what was his name? Shoot, let me check here for you. Yeah, Rudy Miola. His card had him front in the California Angels gear, and on the back was his Padre kind of information, that kind of thing. He was traded in 75, so nobody caught it and that kind of stuff. But it wasn't a big deal. If you had that card, it was a simple air card. We've all had air cards throughout the 76 and forward Topps sets. So, but it was just something interesting to point out that, Topps did obviously. Did not proofread, I guess, this card as quite close as they did with the other ones. Yeah, so earlier, remember how I said, 1976 Topps really didn't celebrate the bicentennial of the United States? I guess you could say they did in a way. In 1976, they helped the Continental Baking Company, which we know is Hostess Cupcakes, create some baseball cards for the kids. And those cards were on the bottom of the boxes of ding dongs and, Hostess ho hos, any kind of, Suzy Q's, any kind of Hostess cupcakes. And if you were a kid at that time, and even a few years going forward, you remember those cards on the bottom of the Hostess boxes. You had to either cut them out somehow or cut them out, with a knife or a pair of scissors. And obviously, you didn't really do the best job cutting them out. I didn't. I do remember those. And I could remember some of those cards cut out of there were pretty bad. I think if any grading company saw that, they would probably say, "Yeah, that's hand trimmed." But anyways, those cards were decorated in a similar motif of bicentennial. A lot of the photos were the same as Topps cards from that year in 76, but those cards had a red, white, and blue theme that kids loved, and they came in a 3-card panel on the bottom of those cards. But I believe, that was the way that Topps helped out that company create some cards for the kids, and in a way they celebrated the bicentennial of the United States in 1976. So this is kind of just a little, tidbit about the packaging of the Topps. There was two kind of ways that the cards came in wrapped up packs. One was, they were 15 cents for 10 cards and 10 cents for 7 cards. One of them had 1976 Topps on them, and the other said all 666 cards in one series. And that was kind of a nod to everything was all together rather than as way back, in past series, going back to the early 70s and 60s and 50s, where Topps released series 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, or whatever going forward. So a lot of those high number series were hard to get. And Topps was kind of eluding in the packaging that, well, now, we're going to have all the cards at once, so you're not going to miss out on everything. But that was the way that it was at your corner drugstore, corner gas station, or your corner, five and dime. Getting cards was those two kind of iterations, so kids could get a little bit and pay a little bit more, or whatever money they had, they could still get some baseball cards. So I told you earlier in the video about how Topps helped and worked with a NBC Today Show host. Well, that was back in 1976, and that host was former baseball player, former baseball personality Joe Garagiola, and his business card of all things. Topps created for him a business card, and the front design was 1973 Topps, but the back with his information and kind of the design on the back was a 1976 Topps back. And on the back, it had his contact information for the NBC Today Show at Rockefeller Center in New York City. But that was created for him as a business card, and it integrated the different kinds of Topps into one card. and he was allowed to use that and pass that out. And that was just because he was an ambassador for baseball and he had worked through Tops. He had worked with Tops throughout the years. So kind of like a thank you. They designed a business card for him that, is not widely held, but there are some out there. So that's neat that they helped out Joe with his business card. Well, that closes up 1976 Tops for us. If you haven't seen the first video, the link's right here, probably around my head somewhere. But other than that, I hope you've enjoyed it. I've tried to expand a little bit more on things. And we'll see you again, once again, as we go beyond the cardboard.